Thank you, everyone, for joining us here at the Project Censored Radio Show. We're very glad right now to be joined by Max Rameau, who is a Haitian-born Pan-African theorist, campaign strategist, organizer, and author of the book Take Back the Land, which chronicles the movement he helped found in 2006 to combat gentrification and address land issues in the Black community. He now organizes with Pan-African Community Action and travels the country facilitating workshops, engaging in campaign strategy sessions, and developing models for community control over land and the human right to housing. He's also currently working on a book on community control over the police. Max, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me.
Absolutely. So I wanted to start off with a James Baldwin quote, actually, which immediately pinged to mind when I read your quote in a recent Black Agenda Report article. And James Baldwin wrote, "We used to say, if you must call a policeman, for we hardly ever did, for God's sake, try to make sure it's a white one. A Black policeman would completely demolish you. He knew far more about you than a white policeman could, and you were without defenses before this Black brother in uniform, whose entire reason for breathing seemed to be his hope to offer proof that, though he was Black, he was not Black like you." And for me, as someone of Jewish descent, this is also reminiscent of what Viktor Frankl and others have written about the role of the capos in the Jewish guards in concentration camps, and this very twisted psychology of wanting to impress the oppressor. And so, Max, I was wondering if you could dig into this a little bit for us, what you spoke about in this Black Agenda Report article, the issue that seems to have confounded a lot of folks with regards to this murder of Tyree Nichols and the role of Black officers in United States policing.
Yeah, well, first of all, I think the Baldwin quote is really apropos, and the fact that that quote comes from the early 1960s, I think, and it still is applicable today, says a lot about the system of policing, not about individual cops, but about the system of policing. And even in the famous song "F the Police," there is a couple of lines about how Black police act out when they are when they're engaging with people who in the Black community. So this is a theme that has run throughout the integration of police departments in the United States, it seems that the thoughts about the role of Black police is consistent throughout that time, and that is that they don't make a bit of difference. In fact, in some cases, they make it worse. So I do think that says a lot to me about what the system of policing is rather than the individual. And then that goes to this moment when we're thinking and talking about Black police. So of course, we're used to the news, unfortunately, we're used to the news of multiple white police officers beating or shooting a Black person who they encounter. But the less heard of news is when you have multiple Black police officers doing the same. Although in the Black community, this is very well known that this happens, this is common. So I think that many people in the Black community, of course, are confused by it and don't want to then attack a Black person, and that's causing some political confusion. And so there's not the level of visceral response to this situation that there are to others. I think had this been white cops and Tyree Nichols, we would have seen an urban rebellion flash up here. But I think that the fact that those Black cops caused some moments of confusion inside of the communities in general, and even inside of social movements. But in the end, I don't think that it makes a bit of difference if the cops are Black or white. What makes a difference is what is the system that the armed wing is supporting. And if it's a just system, then you're going to have some things happen with the enforcement wing. And if you have an unjust system, then different things will happen with the enforcement wing. But the police really are the enforcement wing of the system. And to that extent, there's really no way to reform it into any kind of decent thing, because the system itself, the system that it is protecting and enforcing, is itself bad.
Yeah, absolutely. And we've mentioned before on the show that, of course, police are descended in terms of their job. They are descended from slave patrols. So the idea that you could decouple the police from racism is ludicrous. And And I wanted to, because it's Black History Month as well. And there was recently, I can't remember exactly which police department it was, but there was some video of a police department unveiling a new like car or van or something like that, and it had like Black History Month emblazoned on the side of the car.
Yeah, multiple police departments did that. City of Miami and a couple of others.
And I'm just so of course this clashes with what you've talked about and what we understand as this problem of inherent racism in the police force. But can you talk about what should people really get from Black History Month that is, of course, not going to be shared with folks via a police department, or it's going to. Oh, I can't hear you anymore. Alrighty, so I'll just start the question over.
Sure.
And okay, so we have these ridiculous images of police vehicles with, Black History Month emblazoned on the side. And I know that your work focuses a lot on community control of the police. And I was wondering if you could, because I think sometimes when people hear that, they're like, oh, is that like the community working with the police? And I was wondering if you could make the distinction between like what these cars seem to be an attempt at, like police inserting themselves into Black communities, or co-opting, like something like Black Lives Matter and those movements. Can you talk about how that's different from community control of the police?
Sure. Well, I think this is also where the Baldwin quote that you gave at the top was very instructive here in terms of the difference between community control versus what they call community policing. So when Baldwin says that the reason you don't want to call Black cops is that they know more about you than the white cops ever could, and therefore they have the ability to do more damage, either themselves physically or by going to your family and saying things and causing havoc and chaos inside of your own community. I think this is what community policing is. So regular policing is when the cop who slams you on the hood of the car, chases you, slams you on the hood of the car and arrests you, doesn't even know who you are. The other one, with community policing, they see you, they don't need to chase you, to slam you, they just go to your neighborhood and they ask a few people and they bring a pie to the grandma and they ask who this person is, and then they find out, and then they can just catch you whenever they catch you. So but the end result is the same. The end result is that the person gets arrested. In fact, when you think about it, the end result of the community policing gets more people arrested, because it's not just a question of can you outrun this person. The question is, what kind of ways what other methods or ways does this person have of this cop have arresting you? So I think those are that's what community policing really is, and that doesn't speak to any of the issues that we're really concerned about over at Pan-African Community Action, which is who's actually in control, who actually has power over this force. I think a lot of the organizations now and individuals who talk about, for example, defunding the police, they often say that they want to defund the police, and I believe that they mean it, of course. But even when they're doing that, they have inside of their own organization some security measures that they take, and even some forces inside that you could call a security force. So they have meetings and they have people to check who's coming into the meetings and this, that, and the other thing. So people are not against some security force. People are against a security force that is run by capitalists, by white supremacists, and by patriarchs. And so what we need is a force that is run by people who are workers and people who are anti-racist and people who are anti-sexist. And that's ultimately what we need. And when we talk about community control, we're not talking about police getting to know your neighborhood better. We're talking about the neighborhood being in control and having power over the police. The neighborhood saying, these are the laws we want you to enforce. These are the laws we want you to de-emphasize. And then when you're enforcing those laws, this is the way we want you to do it. And if you can't do it this way, then we can fire you. And we can order the rest of our force to arrest you for violating the rules that we set in place. And those are the kind of things that I think we would want to have happen in terms of community control. And that's the difference between community control versus community policing.
Yeah, thank you for that distinction. And I'm also curious about there's a conversation about how, you know, the today's police in the United States are, as I mentioned, descended, so to speak, from slave patrols. And there's a conversation about how the abolitionist movement today is therefore abolishing the institution of police. How do you feel about that movement, and how does that relate to community control over the police?
Yeah, so I think, first of all, I have great admiration for the abolition movement, the abolition of certainly of prisons, and even of police. And I have a lot of sympathy. I think ultimately I want to get there. I just think what we have to get correct is the sequence. So if you're thinking in terms of thinking of society in dialectical terms, anytime you have classes, one group of people that has something at the expense of another group of people, then you have to have some kind of security force. Call them whatever you want. It just, you know, you're identifying correctly that what we now think of as the police came out of the slave patrols. And that's true, as a direct descendant of that. That's that kind of like that lineage. But that doesn't mean that there were no police, quote unquote, not policing the way we think of it now, but there was no policing happening before the United States or the Europeans dominated the Americas. There were kings and queens had their the royal guards, and even before that, the Roman Empire had the centurions. So there were always security forces, armed enforcement forces around. Anytime that there's the haves, and those haves have at the expense of the have-nots, you have to have security forces. And anytime you have any kind of classes, that there must be security forces in order to maintain the class relationship. So I think what we really need to get rid of, if we're talking about getting rid of the police, is we need to get rid of classes. We need to eliminate the situation where one group of people has because another group of people does not have. And until we get rid of that, we're not going to be able to get rid, because those who have are going to create the forces. I think the problem and the limitation of thinking about abolishing the police before abolishing classes is that if we were successful, so let's say we're wildly successful, we run a campaign all week, and on Friday we win and the police are abolished. What happens on Monday morning? Does Walmart open up and say, well, there's no police, I guess we're just going to, you know, take our luck here? No, they are going to hire their own private security force, and the private security force is not going to enforce the ostensibly objective public laws. They're going to enforce whatever the board of directors of Walmart tells them to enforce, and that we would have none of the public records laws and things like that, which you know, as bad as they are, as Swiss cheese as they may be. They would seem like heaven compared to what we would get in comparison. When you look at places where they have a lot of private security, places like South Africa, even in Haiti, although Haiti has less of a police force even there, then those private security forces don't work out well for us at all. And there will be a direct line. It would actually be a throwback to the centurions and to the knights of the king and queen, because there will be no state in between the ruling class and the police. It will be, the police would be working directly for the ruling class. That would be all kinds of trouble. I think we need to get rid of the ruling class, and that would result in getting rid of the police.
Yeah, that's very good points. And in that same vein of thinking about the steps here, you know, the famous quote, "Power concedes nothing." How do you get the police and the people who control the police to hand over that control and be like, yeah, you know what? Good point. The communities should have control over this entity.
Yeah, so I think, let me just say that the answer is organizing. And we have to organize in a way that we can take power ourselves, not organize in a way that we are asking or begging or even demanding of others that we get power. So once we're organized to a certain level, we're going to be able to build up those forces inside of ourselves. As an intermediate point, though, we're still organizing. We still have to organize. What Paca is proposing is that we create a ballot initiative that calls for community control of police. And this is modeled entirely, by the way, off of the Black Panther Party, who did the same thing in 1968 in Berkeley, California, and in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, where they got a ballot initiative. They lost in both instances, but they got a ballot initiative. What the ballot initiative calls for is dividing or organizing the city or the whatever municipality into policing districts, and those policing districts can be independent or they could be exactly identical to the political districts or wards of that city. So Washington, D.C., for example, has wards. It could match the wards exactly, or it doesn't have to. It has 8 wards, so we could have 8 policing districts. And then each district would then get a ballot, would get a vote. And the members of that district would get a question. Do you want to keep the existing police force that you have? Or do you want to vote them out and have your own police force? And some people are going to be like, we love the police force. We want to keep them. Take your vote, keep them. Others are going to say, you know what, they're not doing anything for us. And we know, we live here in DC, we say we live in Ward 8, which is an overwhelmingly Black ward. And we know that you actually work for the white people across town. So we don't think that you work for us. We know you don't work for us. So we don't want this. We want our own force that knows that they came in existence because of us. And they know that we're the ones in charge and we can fire them. So then Ward 8, for example, would say we want to have our own force. And then that means that the police lines will be redrawn and there will be new police departments around town. Maybe there'll be 2, maybe there'll be 4, whatever the number there would be. Then each district could have a chance to get its own police department, at least have a say. So this would do a couple of things. This would democratize the police. Number one, and number two is for those communities that say we want to have control over our police, they would get a say in what the police do and how they do it. So that's how we think we would do this. And of course, if we win this, we think it would win in Black communities across the United States. But if we get this on the ballot and we win and we vote this in, and then the system comes back and says, to your point, you know, how do you get them to come back and says, look, we know we've been talking democracy, all this stuff, but we don't really mean it. You know, we didn't mean this. We didn't mean that Black people could vote with their police. We didn't mean you could have guns. So if that's what happens, then we'll be happy to have that result, because then we will be able to say they never meant it anyhow. This is the way it really is. It really expose the system to what it is. So all we're calling for is democracy.
Yeah, pretty simple ask in a country that says it is one. Or a republic, or however you want to frame that. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think that I mean, there's so many threads that can be pulled there, and I do want to discuss something that the intersection of issues, because I think that that's also a very important point, and it really speaks to your past work as well. And I lived in DC for a long time, and there was an action that we did in Ward 1, which was where I lived, and there was a community housing that was trying to be taken over because it was a prime spot in Ward 1, and you know, it looked out over the, you know, you could see the Capitol from there, you could see the Washington Monument, and the housing authority was desperate to turn that into, you know, luxury condos or whatever. And so we did this banner drop at one point that said Black Homes Matter. And of course, there was some police attention, and there was therefore a lot of conversations in the mutual aid group about linking the concept of housing, the basic human right to housing, and keeping communities safe with regards to police as well. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about that too, because as I noted in the intro, you have a history of dealing with community control of housing, community control over land. How do you feel that links, and in your own work as well, the trajectory from community control over housing and land to community control over the police?
Well, we think that community control is the first step towards self-determination, towards saying that we want to exercise self-determination in a broad sense over the economy, over housing, over education, over food, over all those different areas of our collective lives. So we do think there's a connection. I think also, if you look at one piece, either community control of housing or community control over police, you can see how even if we won that one sector of society, we would not be satisfied with that. So let's say we get community control over housing. Well, then great. Now we have housing available for people, community control over land, and we turn that land to housing. Then we have housing for people, but we're still hungry. We're still undereducated. We are still then, even though we have housing, we're still under or unemployed. And so we're now living in a house, but we don't have electricity in the house, or we don't have food in the house, or we don't have good education. So it would solve some problems, but it would just really give us more time to recognize how serious our other problems are. So that will be it on that. And just as important, we would be, because we don't have a job and because we don't have good education, because we don't have any money, we'd just be hanging around in front of our houses, which means the police would come by and start harassing us for hanging around in front of our houses, right? So it would then highlight how we don't even have it. Conversely, if we get community control of the police, then that means we would no longer be harassed for hanging around in our own neighborhoods, but it means that we wouldn't have anywhere to live and we'd still be hungry and we'd still be undereducated. So I think that winning in one of these sectors would then necessarily result in growing a movement that would then go across to different sectors. And what we want to do is we want to build movements that when they're successful, they don't stop, they don't end the movement, but they actually encourage the movement to continue forward and to grow. And that's what I think would happen here. But ultimately, we want to string together a series of interlocking and interrelated community control campaigns that would ultimately result in a broader sense of self-determination.
Yeah, thank you for that. So, of course, it is Black History Month in the U.S. And one of the things that I often think is important is to highlight the history that we're not taught in schools, which is basically, I think, most of Black history, really. And even though we had Black History Month when I was in school, it was like Martin Luther King Jr. and then let's go to lunch. Nobody's talking about Huey P. Newton in their social studies class. So I'm curious, what do you feel is are some important things to highlight right now in terms of recognizing either through either through community control over the police? You mentioned the Black Panthers, but also community control over land. Some things that we might be able to look at in Black history that could be guides or inspiration for these fights today.
Well, right now, there is a lot of talk about community land trusts, for example, as it certainly came up significantly when the housing bubble crashed in 2008, 2007, 2008. There was talk about, okay, so what do we do? What's the alternative? And there was significant talk about community land trusts and what are community land trusts and how do they work? And of course, community land trusts are just ways of collectively owning land. So instead of one person owning it, then you have groups of 10 or 50 or 10,000 people who collectively own land and make decisions about it. Well, the first community land trust in the United States was in the South, was a collective of Black farmers in the South. So community land trust, the very idea of community land trust, which has really been picking up steam in the past decade or so, came from Black farmers and what they were trying to do and how they were trying to survive in a overwhelmingly white supremacist world. So I think that is an important community control over education. We can, of course, look at the Black Panther Party, but there's many other examples of local communities who fought for community control over their own schools or their own education. There was a move in the 1970s to have community control over schools in New York City. In the Bronx, there were Black and Puerto Rican and other Latino communities who wanted to take over their schools and sought to do that and wanted to have these community control boards take over local public schools. And they did so with some limits. And then when they made a move to start moving out racist teachers who were overtly teaching white supremacy inside of schools that were 90% people of color, then the teachers went on strike. And that led to the biggest teacher strike in New York City history, in the United States history. The biggest teacher strike in US history was in response to and a fight back against community control. But there was a real attempt at community control over schools happened in New York and of course in many other places as well. And there's a growing number of independent Black schools that are opening now. And for community control over land, of course, we had Take Back the Land, which did it in a very particular way that I was a part of. But there's been other organizations who are doing all kinds of work, other organizations who work particularly in the South that are looking to take over land or looking to build co-ops or community land trusts of multiple farmers, multiple housing complexes, and to bring the benefits of collective economics to a particular living situation, which would be just short of self-determination, but which would be intended to work inside of this context, inside of the context of capitalism inside the US.
Yeah. Wow. Thank you. And of course, there's so much going on currently. There's, you mentioned community land trusts right now in Washington, D.C. My former mutual aid group is working on actually, it's called the Baldwin House,
Yes,
a co-op, housing
I've heard of
co-op.
it. Mhm.
Oh, cool. Well, yay.
Yes,
I was there at the beginning before I had to leave the country.
that's great.
Um, but yeah, so there's so much rad work happening about that. And so as we wrap up here, I want to ask a question, because I think that this is something that that has come up a lot in organizing spaces, in terms of how white folks in particular, but non-Black folks or folks who are not of African descent, how we can best support these initiatives, how we can best, in the case of white folks, use that white privilege, not just in terms of, the housing issue, but perhaps more pointedly, the policing issue.
Yeah, so I think there's a couple of things. One, of course, is as use the term you just did, is to support independent Black organizations, not just individuals, but actual organizations that are doing good radical work, that are looking to shift power. I think that's the key lens to look at it. What work is intended to shift power, as opposed to reform existing institutions. So look for the work that looks like it's moving towards shifting power, and support that work. So that's one way, and I think that's a really significant way of doing it. The second way, though, I think that is really underestimated and not pursued often enough, is there needs to be more organizing happening inside of white communities. And like, we can't do that if white communities are attacking and are displaying white supremacy against Black communities, and Black people can't go and do that. But white communities, people inside of the white community, have to do that. So I think organizing white communities to be anti-racist is some of the most important work that's happening right now. We can see the importance of it as we see the lack of it happening in white communities, and you have a growth of Nazism, and a growth in the form of MAGA and these other strains, right-wing Christian ideologies. So you have these growing white supremacist groups, overtly white supremacist groups, which needs some sort of intervention. And I think that their ability to grow at the rate at which they're growing would have been limited if there would have been better organizing inside of the white community. So I think that's probably some of the more important work that has to happen. And that means getting white folks to getting white folks to recognize the privilege that they have, not that they don't have problems, and not that life is not difficult for them, but that they do have privilege inside of this society, and to fight for an actual fair society. And a fair society would help everyone all the way around when we win. But we have to win, and everyone has to be in the fight in order to win. I think those are the two important things: so support work in Black communities that are shifting power, and then organize inside of white communities into anti-racist groups. And let me say on a related note, I think some of the most important work that's happening now in Black communities are Black men organizing anti-patriarchal work inside of the Black community. I think all of those things have to happen, and that's our equivalent inside of the Black communities, is to end patriarchy inside of our communities, but also support women who are moving into positions of power inside of our social movements and other organizations, but also ending patriarchy among men, breaking down the patriarchy and the organization of men inside of our community. So we need to be doing the same thing in our community, but we're asking that our allies do the same inside of theirs.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it was, I'm going to ruin it because I don't remember the exact quote, but Bell Hooks said something like, we have to love men just for them being men, not because of what society has made us expect men to be. So yeah, patriarchy harms men very much. And yeah, and I usually say that white privilege doesn't mean that you've had an easy life. It just means that your life hasn't been hard because of the color of your skin.
Yeah. I think also, in the same way that patriarchy hurts men, white supremacy also hurts white people. And when white people come to recognize that, then I think that will be a watershed moment and would allow societies to move forward.
Yeah. Thank you so much for that, Max. I mean, I feel like I could talk to you for 3 hours, but unfortunately it is a short show and you probably have a life to live. So, but where can folks find more about the work that you're doing, and when can we expect your book?
So you can find out more about the work we're doing at our organizational website, which is pacapower.org. That's PACA power.org. And the book, we're hoping to get it out by the end of this summer. But if we can move some things around, it could happen sooner. But we would like to really take on the idea of community control over police. And we put out several essays, but we want to get the full book out by this summer.
Okay, fantastic. Well, we'll keep our eyes peeled for it. Thank you, Max, so much for joining the show.
I want to thank you so much for having me.